And so today is the fourth session of this series, and the title of today's session is Walking the Path of Reconciliation, BC Transit Journey. And as we all know, we received many communications about this already. And of course, this is something super important. September is a very, very crucial month leading up to the 5th National Day for Truth and Reconciliation on September 30th. And so this session, I think, could not come at a better time. And our facilitator today is the wonderful Svea Wilson, the Manager of Indigenous Relations at BC Transit. Svea, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time, for your generosity. I am personally super excited about today's session. I told you this on Friday or on Thursday when we were meeting last. Every time we meet, I feel very energized, and also I learn so much from you, from your wisdom, from your expertise. And so I'm very grateful for your openness today to facilitate this session with all of us. So thank you for being here. Thank you as well to all of you for being here. And Svea, over to you.
Thank you. Just someone, if you could give a thumbs up, Julia, maybe, that you can hear me. Good. Okay. I have one of those like flip up to like unmute, flip down, and the amount that has given me troubles. Thank you, Julia, for that incredible introduction. Yeah, I'm so excited to be able to get this opportunity to just chat with everybody. I'm going to just share my presentation here. And again, maybe another thumbs up just if you can see it. There it is. So, as Julia mentioned, and I know, Julia, I can see your screen, so if you want to just give me a thumbs up, that'd be perfect. Thank you. So as Julia mentioned, September we're leading up to the 30th, which is our 5th National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. And through the Idea Speaker series, Julia and I really came together, and I thought, what a better way to really set the groundwork for, why reconciliation is so important and really the context behind it. How did we get to this point? And then obviously knowing that there's such a call on organizations and individuals to make meaningful change in this work. And so what does that truly mean? Walking the path of reconciliation, BC Transit's journey. You notice I intentionally use the word walking. Reconciliation is really not a destination, and I'm really excited to reflect on that today in the sense of it's a journey. It requires patience, it requires humility, and ongoing commitment really is the biggest piece as well. So really my hope today is to just share not only BC Transit's journey so far, but also really to ground our conversation in the bigger context of what is reconciliation within Canada, what is, our individual work within this, because it really doesn't fall within one team or one person. And honestly, I hope to just leave everybody with a little bit of reflection on not only our journey at BC Transit, but also your own individual one and what it means in kind of your individual roles. So I'm going to kick it off in terms of like questions and comments. There's lots of interactive points to pause, and I'll obviously leave time at the end. Feel free to throw things in the chat, and if I notice that, I'll definitely make sure to address it. I am so excited that this was the most popular, speaker series so far. And I will say also, from a presentation perspective, I was like, what? I'm so nervous. So I'm very thankful this is virtual, because I'd probably be way more nervous and my voice would be shaking if it was in front of everyone's faces. But I'm just so thankful. That just goes to show everyone's willingness to want to make an impact, to learn. I think the fact that people want to know what was going on in this space just makes me so grateful to work at this organization. So with that, let's get into it. So, of course, a territorial acknowledgement. I want to thank Julia for setting us up in such a good way here. Just doing a little brief one of my own. So I'm calling today from BTC. Our head office is located on the lands of Lekwungen peoples, whose relationship not only with land, but always acknowledging their relationship with water too, being a Coast Salish territory. And that representation comes from the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. So I always want to give thanks to the territory that we are on. While we're on this slide, I also just want to briefly touch on territorial acknowledgements. And so really they are more than just acknowledging where you are. It's really about taking that extra step to fully understand that. To know the community, to know the people, to know the name is one thing. It's another thing to educate yourself on the land. And so that's why I intentionally put a picture here of one of the signs of Lekwungen. So anyone who's ventured downtown Victoria, you've probably seen, we have some at the BC Museum, a couple downtown. We have them all along the water, really. And it was actually a project featuring Butch Dick. He is an artist from Sawridge Nation, and he basically created these like large spindle whorls, which basically look exactly like a traditional spindle wheel, which is used by Coast Salish women through history, basically spinning, whether it's fleece. They would use wool from like a Salish dog. Thank you, Julia. Yeah, include the. So I always recommend people to, that's one simple way that you can connect with the traditional territories of Victoria and learn a little bit about the history of Lekwungen peoples. There's also such symbolism in the imagery as well. So each image, each spindle wheel will have its own image, and that often I was doing some research into it, and it actually has significance in that they utilize different images for different meanings, whether it's prosperity, whether it's learning, whether it's language. So yeah, I always recommend, like, this is another aspect outside of just acknowledging the territory that we can truly make, and that's taking the learnings from what this beautiful city has to offer. And this kind of ties in perfectly too, because we're talking transit, we are BC Transit. And so when we're talking lands, what we have is the opportunity to provide movement across these lands. So we always have to remember the histories and the rights that are connected to these lands when we think about what we do on a day-to-day basis. We put buses on the road to get people from one place of connection to another place of connection. So really our work here is really rooted in land and rooted in territory. So just always like to add a little something to territorial acknowledgements that make it a little bit more meaningful than just feeling like a little bit of a script. So now that we feel grounded in our territory and where we're meeting from today, let's talk a little bit about who I am. So with this work, it is more than just a professional title for me. And so as Julia mentioned in the intro, I'm Svea Wilson. I am BC Transit's Indigenous Relations Manager, and I really lead a lot of our reconciliation efforts alongside so many people in the organization. But my connection to this work is so much more than that. Little bit about me. I grew up in my traditional territory, which is the Sawridge Reserve, located in Treaty 8 territory, just around Lesser Slave Lake, if anyone's familiar with the Alberta territory. And I spent about the first 6 years connected with my community, learning as much as I can. And I'd be the first to say that also came with its own aspects of trauma. When we're going to get into some of those long legacy histories that Indigenous people have endured. And through that, and this is actually some images here. That's the beautiful lake, which is Slave Lake. The bottom image is actually the band office, which still to this day, when we have our in-person meetings with our nation, our assembly meetings monthly, we still gather there. And so a lot of these images, like, they bring up so much nostalgia for me, but it also recognizes some of the aspects of where my disconnection started. And so really where I'm on a journey of right now is learning the truth of a lot of stories, a lot of things that I was protected from growing up, that, my grandmother, who's a residential school survivor, unfortunately, her story moved along with her, and we've not ever heard the truth of that. And with that comes a lot of shame, a lot of not feeling enough, not feeling like you know enough, feeling very disconnected. And I've been now on a professional journey to undo a lot of that, to learn my history, to learn my language, to learn my more about my community, and then also to make a difference in my everyday life. And I always say, BC Transit, when I first started, didn't have the Indigenous relations role, and I thought, what a great organization to work with while I build myself to where I want to be. So I was going to Camosun for their Indigenous Studies program. And I thought, I'll work full time at BC Transit. What a great way to kind of make ends meet, I guess. And then through my work here, the role for Indigenous Relations Manager came up. And I mean, there's maybe some people on the call I've had conversations with where I almost didn't feel like that was a space I could step into. I felt, with a little bit of disconnection, with my fear of not being Indigenous enough with all of these things. And you know what? That right there is what Indigenous people endure every single day, is that feeling of I can't, I'm not enough, I can't do it. And so kudos to some of the incredible people, on this call and in this organization, who really pushed me and said, you know, this is your dream. This is your life's work. You talk about this like you are so unbelievably passionate about it. And why not make your passion your profession? And so I'm very excited to be in this role now. And I'm so excited to share kind of some of the stuff that we've been working on, that I've been doing. But none of this is possible without everyone in the organization having that willingness to change. And I recognize there's barriers and challenges, and we're going to touch on some of that today. So now that you know me, you kind of know what we're here to discuss. Kind of the base level is like, what is reconciliation? And so before we really dive into that, I'm going to call on everybody. I just want to know, in one word, how would you describe reconciliation? This can be as simplistic as just the definition of reconciliation. This can be in terms of Canada's history with Indigenous peoples, how you also frame it, but just one word that comes to mind when you hear reconciliation. I'll give everyone a couple moments. Healing, yep. Honesty, truth, yep. Justice, decolonization, yep. True understanding. I love the themes. Amazing. I love, out of 49 responses, how much learning is just like standing out. Uncomfortable. Yes, that is such a good one. Absolutely. I always say in this work, you know, if it doesn't make you a little uncomfortable, you're not challenging yourself enough. Acknowledgement, change. Amazing. Yeah. And you know what? All of them in every single way tie into what reconciliation truly is. Again, this themes around truth, learning, understanding, listening. We don't have the answers to it as of right now, but what we do know is we need to sit back and we need to listen to survivors, to those who really were impacted and have the experience to speak on this need for change. Amazing. All right, we're going to close that. If there's any more that come into mind, feel free to put those in the chat. So in terms of reconciliation, and now I tried to add an animation and I'm not good with PowerPoint, so let's see how this works out. Yay, okay. So the Oxford Dictionary definition of reconciliation is an end to a disagreement or conflict with somebody and the start of a good relationship again. That's just the Oxford Dictionary, so not context to Canada, but notice that word of good relationship again, good relationship, being in relationship, that two-eyed way of seeing. And so in terms of the actual TRC's definition, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's definition of what reconciliation is, and we'll touch on kind of the commission in a little bit, but it describes reconciliation as an ongoing process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada, coming to terms with events of the past in a manner that overcomes conflict and establishes a respectful and healthy relationship among people going forward, which perfectly, I think, was captured through that word cloud of, you know, it is about learning, it is about listening, it is about hearing survivors and their stories in terms of building something new going forward. And so I also always want to recognize that we talk so heavily about truth and reconciliation, and through working at such a beautiful, diverse organization, I also recognize how many people might not even understand what that history is within Canada. I think if you grew up going to school within Canada, you have heard many times, you know, what we were taught in school versus what the truth is. And a lot of that is starting to come to people's mind. But let's also recognize how many people move maybe here from another part of the world unaware of Canada's history it's so isolated. Canada and countries in general with colonization have done so well at isolating a lot of those stories that, why does this resonate with everybody? And so I do want to touch on that because I recognize not everyone is going to have that understanding of how we ended up here today. Before I go to the next slide, because it is touching on the truth, which has to be discussed and has to be the groundwork before you can talk reconciliation, I do want to just give a bit of a trigger warning, whether Indigenous or non-Indigenous. I just want to remind everybody of the Employee Family Assistance Program. For Indigenous employees, there's Indigenous resources there to talk to people with that expertise and that background. And as well, always the Residential School Survivors hotline, which we can pop in the chat quickly too. Just utilize your resources. Some of this stuff is never comfortable to talk about. And I recognize that sometimes it can always be like, okay, well, we got to touch on the heavy, and it may be a lot for everybody. But what I always say is I'm like, yeah. And the amount that Indigenous people had to live with that, it's okay that every time we come together for a new learning that we have to touch on it because Indigenous people have had to live it. So going to the next slide, warning with that trigger warning. The image as well is quite powerful and was something I considered not putting in here, but thought it spoke so well to bringing up some feelings of, the impact of the harm that was imposed. So truth before reconciliation. Now, before we can really talk about reconciliation, as I've mentioned, you always have to acknowledge the truth. And if you reflect on the timeline here, and I'm not going to dive into each of these individual aspects of harm or discovery that have occurred, I just always want to ground us in the fact that the path here has been marked by these deep injustices and these harms. I always like to look at it as 1493. So the doctrine of discovery. First time it was, hey, there's land here, unclaimed, which at the time colonizers saw it as, and where we went until we realized we had the first TRC final report. So Truth and Reconciliation Commission, who finally made a big call for 94 calls to change. What is that? How many hundreds of years? And so when people talk reconciliation, I always want to acknowledge that we're not at reconciliation yet. And I think everyone hears, truth and reconciliation and what can we do to embed reconciliation into everything we do. And we're starting to. We're very much starting to, but we're also very much behind and have a long way to go. And I think that's always kind of sometimes jarring for people to hear because you hear of all the harm that was done and you just want to undo it so quickly. And how I always look at it is look at the hundreds of years it took to impose that harm, to try and take away culture, to take away language, to take children from their families. It took hundreds of years. And heck yeah, the resilience of Indigenous people is so strong, and I am so proud to be Indigenous because of it. But it's going to take just as many hundreds of years to undo that harm, to rebuild the trust, and to find a new path forward. And so I just always want to reflect on this before always going into the great work we're doing, because I always want to be mindful that I'm excited to share about all the wonderful things we're doing, but I'm also going to be the first one to say we're not there yet and we have so much more to do. And this is a slow process, and that's okay. It's about learning, listening, trying something, maybe not getting it right, but ensuring that that intention came from Indigenous people's voices, from survivors' voices. And so the truth really is foundational to any meaningful reconciliation. Which leads me to kind of our own learning journey and the call for each of us as individuals to understand the truth before we can really lean into reconciliation. And so I always call on people for continuous learning. There are so many things and opportunities available to learn more and to understand more. I also just want to touch on this painting before I move into kind of some of the resources that we currently have available. So if anyone had the privilege of partaking in the culturally committed sessions, and I'll touch on that a little bit later when we talk about employment and education initiatives, but Daniel Elliott was one of the mentors, the Indigenous mentors and actually elder that we worked with through those calls. And he is a very, very talented painter. And if you've ever gotten to see the strategic plan painting that he did for our organization that is in the atrium of VTC, I highly recommend you check it out. He is so talented. But him and I have had many conversations, and this image has just stuck with me to the point where I'm like, Dan, I need it framed. I need to get my hands on it. I will pay you whatever. Like, it is such an impactful image that if you ever get the opportunity to hear Dan speak about it, he talks about how really reconciliation and how the eagle is coming in to lift the roofs off of those historical buildings that cause so much harm, and the amount of black smoke and dust because so much darkness was hidden within those buildings. And still to this day, there are so many stories that we're unaware of. There are so many truths that have not yet been told. And so just want to shout out our incredible friend, Daniel. And for anyone who wants to kind of find his art, you can always look that up. He's Indigenous First Nation. And he's been so great. Anyone who went to the Red Banquet as well, he opened us up in such a great way. And so again, relationship, it's all about keeping these connections. So continuous learning. Again, we had those opportunities with Culturally Committed, and I'm the first to say, the learning journey hasn't stopped, and there's so much happening in the background to continue to find ways to bring this to employees. But for anyone who didn't partake in that, they are recorded on My Path. And so my biggest recommendation would be the part 1, 2, and 3 webinars around truth, resilience, and reconciliation. Those are hosted by Jen Smith, another culturally committed Indigenous mentor from Sawridge First Nation. And she just has this really meaningful way of taking you through the truth, the history, and where we need to go. And she makes it a very personal story of her own. And so if you're looking for just a first step, for if you're maybe early in your learning journey with this work, I recommend there. We also have a great one called The Journey of Truth and Reconciliation done by a professor from UVic who is extremely knowledgeable in this area. And so if you're looking for ways to reconnect and kind of find deeper purpose and understanding to this work, I recommend that as a starting point. So some of the next information might make a little more sense as you continue to further that journey. So why are we calling for change? Obviously, there's so much harm and so much injustice that happen, but it's not isolated to just our work. It is also guided by so much calls for change by some very meaningful groups. Most prominently, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. So I have 3 pictures here because these people are just very instrumental in Indigenous communities and how we view these 3 and the incredible change that they've brought forward. For anyone who maybe doesn't know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission basically established in 2008 as part of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. So it's actually a mandate was documented to find the truth of survivors, families, and communities so that we can guide reconciliation forward in a good way. So these 3 were put together as the 3 commissioners. On the far left, there is Justice Murray Sinclair. I should say the late Justice Murray Sinclair. He has since passed on last year, and to this day, his quotes and the power of his words are still used across communities. He was the chair of the commission. Chief Wilson Littlechild in the middle. I've actually had the privilege of meeting him, and it was so impactful. We unfortunately didn't get a photo together, and I was so nervous. I don't even remember what I said, but we were so grateful that he was able to come to my nation and more like the tribal council of our nations about 2 years ago. And then Dr. Mary Wilson. So she's a journalist and an educator who has so much experience in storytelling and communication and has really helped ensure that survivors have been heard widely and respectfully. And so this group was put together in 2008, and they went on a journey to listen to as many survivors across Canada as they could. My grandma actually, while not interviewed by them, attended the one then when they came through to Edmonton and sat there and listened to a lot of survivors. They've actually spoken to 6,000, and something that late Murray Sinclair always touches on is like, that was only the ones we could talk to. There were how many in the audience, there were how many people that we have not gotten to connect with that also have a story. So what they did is they listened to those 6,000 survivors. They had conversations, and those are documented. Another thing is how many conversations they had, the three of them separately in different forums. And they put together what is called the TRC final report, the calls to action, the 94 calls to action that I'm sure you hear everyone talking about quite a lot. And that was really the first grounding imperative that we had to make a change. I think Indigenous people have been calling for this for so long, and it was so nice to finally have something in place that could not be ignored. You know, this was mandated by the federal government. These calls to action can't be ignored. That being said, while we have incredible action plans such as the 94 calls to action, I also never want to oversight the National Inquiry into Missing Murder Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit individuals and those calls for justice. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. Let's also not forget UNDRIP. And so UNDRIP is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which actually was adopted by British Columbia in 2019, which we then put into an act known as DRIPA, the Declaration of Our Rights and Indigenous Peoples Act, which also has an action plan associated with it. So constantly we've been having new calls for change, new calls for justice, and what they are is they're calls on governments, on organizations, on municipalities, on province, on the feds, on everyone really. And it comes down to their responsibility now to work with Indigenous people to make that change. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission put these together, the intent isn't to, okay, colonization happened, we need to ignore all of that and go back to exactly how it was before colonizers. No, it's about a two-eyed way of seeing. It's my favorite statement. And if you want to do some more research on what that two-eyed way of seeing means for Indigenous people, it's something that late Justice Murray Sinclair called upon all the time. It's, we need a new way of doing things. There was one way, and then the doctrine of discovery, and then there was a new way. And if we've rewritten a new way, we can learn from all of that and rewrite another thing. So it's not just about throwing everything out the window. It's really about listening and working with Indigenous people to build a new future, one that encapsulates the governance that we currently already have in place, as well as the experience of Indigenous people, and bringing that rights holding position back to them, you know, their land. Let's make sure they're in every conversation about what happens to land, what happens in governance, what happens in relationship. And so something I always want to touch on is that I'm so thankful that we have these calls to action, but we haven't done enough. We being Canada, out of the 94 calls to action, which by the way was finalized in 2015, so it's been 10 years, we've completed 13. And again, I'd call on everybody to check out which 13 really have been completed and to read through those 94 calls to action. I think that's one of the number one things we can do in terms of allyship and supporting reconciliation is understand the calls for change. But again, I'd argue the 13, while great that we've completed some, are the very tangible ones to complete. There's so much more challenge in the ones that we have yet completed. And I think why I'm so excited to talk about this today is just in terms of the denialism in which Indigenous people are having to experience right now. For anyone who isn't sure what that means, there is a lot of people who are claiming that the history of residential schools isn't actually the history in which Indigenous people are claiming has happened. There's a lot of people, and it's really hard in the world that we live in right now. Social media is going to push your biased opinions right to the forefront of your phone. And so we're struggling. It's hard right now to feel like you can speak up about something that so many people feel so passionately didn't actually happen. Especially when you are connected to a survivor yourself, when you hear survivor stories often. And so I always want to say, well, I'm so thankful for the grounding imperatives that form our work. We're not there yet. We have so much more we need to do. These action plans are just that, they're plans. We haven't actually put anything into place. And so I'm so thankful that organizations such as BC Transit are bringing on Indigenous experts to kind of further this work. But we're in those early steps. So setting the groundwork, I hope that helped kind of set some of the meaning behind why reconciliation is so important, why we need to have these calls for change. And then why we're here today is like, what is BC Transit doing about it? What is our call for change? And so our shared responsibility. So I want to just touch on the fact that reconciliation can't sit within one team. It can't sit within one person. And another thing, that's why I'm so excited to see everybody today here to just listen and participate. It just goes to show that looking at the fact that we have 68 people here from our organization today who took time out of their everyday lives to just hear, what's happening at BC Transit, like what can I do for my own role to kind of impact this and further our own journey. So just acknowledging it doesn't fall within one team or one person. It does belong to everyone. And I'm excited to share a little bit how this is going to start to trickle more into your individual roles. But very, very early of our journey, like we started our journey in 2021, and I would say that really started with Julia and team. So the IDEA team really started their groundwork for the roadmap and putting together a group of experts who care about inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility. And that was really when this conversation started. Two key things that then came from that were the hiring of an Indigenous relations manager. So the organization recognized there was a need for a subject matter expert who is knowledgeable to kind of further this work. And I'm so grateful for my opportunity to be in this space as an Indigenous person. One of the TRC's calls to action is, Indigenous people need to lead Indigenous work. And so with the Indigenous Relations Manager role, alongside our executive team, the Indigenous Relations Draft Strategy was created. And I'm sure we've probably thrown that word around quite a bit, and people are like, where is it? What is it? And so really, since then, we've reframed it because draft to me it feels a little unfinished. It doesn't really resonate with the words that I think of when I think reconciliation. And so it's since been named to our Indigenous Relations Evolving Framework. Evolving is basically replacing draft. And by the means of that, it's basically like it's never going to be finished. We always want somewhere where we are gathering what we hear from communities. We want to understand, the access they have to transit. How do they feel in terms of a relationship with BC Transit? Do they feel heard? Do they feel like they have employment opportunities? Do they feel like they have, do we feel like employees have access to education around this work? How is governance decided within that world? Is it an inclusive space where Indigenous people are leading Indigenous work? And so within that evolving framework, it really highlighted that these are some key pillars in which all actions can fall within, all aspects of BC Transit's reconciliation journey can fall within. So with that, all things that we have done in this space of reconciliation falls within building relationships, advancing employment and education, inclusive governance, sustainable funding, and enhancing access. And so that's grounding and that's our guiding pillars. And I'm just highlighting those right away because as we move through, it's how we've kind of categorized everything we've done so far and also how we will continue to categorize our actions moving forward. So the most important one and the one that is grounded in everything we do, and that's building relationships. And so the image here actually captures some of the imagery and logos from nations or organizations that we have worked with. Always such incredible, beautiful art. So when we think about reconciliation, I think it is so easy to jump to what can we do now? What are the wins we can make? Policies, programs, action plans, all these things. And absolutely, but who is informing that? It has to be through relationships. You cannot start moving forward with Indigenous work until you're talking to Indigenous people. And that expands beyond just the ones who work for an organization. It expands to the communities we serve. It expands to the potential Indigenous employees who maybe see BC Transit as a employment opportunity. And so really none of it matters without relationships that guide everything we do. And so as I move forward to share some of our initiatives, I always want to set that not that expectation. I always want to set that standard that it's coming from relationships. Everything we're doing is based on conversations with Indigenous communities and organizations. As everyone knows, and we'll touch on it, we have some great partnerships within Victoria, but we're also really trying to make some effort in reaching out to some of those First Nations across the province and, who maybe lack access to service, and how can we make sure they're aware of the challenges and barriers that we come across, but ensure that we have commitments and things that we can move forward. So if we don't build trust with Indigenous communities, then honestly, any plan, any engagement process, any policy that we try to create will fall short. Trust really comes from showing up consistently, listening deeply, and following through on what we say we're going to do. So relationships grounding everything. Let's move into that next guiding pillar, which is advancing employment and education. And so I think for the audience, this is probably the one that you see the most, that you have the most internal access to. And so just to briefly touch on it, we went from Indigenous Relations Manager and that evolving framework to people and culture, who I work within now, who, jumped ahead and said, we recognize as, people and culture who does hiring, who does interviews, talent advisors, our people and culture advisors. We recognize that there's so many employment opportunities that we can take on. And so people and culture worked with a consulting organization, Gemma Scoble, who I've actually worked very closely with in a lot of infrastructure projects. And I will say they handle this work with such care. And they helped create the Indigenous Employment Roadmap, which we've now incorporated into a further action plan, which I'll touch on in a little bit. Culturally committed, we had our phase 1 and phase 2 approach. Phase 1 touching on people leaders, and phase 2 having that MyPath access for the rest of the organization. It was incredible to get to be in relationship and I think see non-Indigenous people find that comfort in asking questions, and it's such an inclusive space. And again, we still have access to those 3 webinars if you want to, if you haven't had a chance to take those courses. We implemented Indigenous cultural leave days. And so Indigenous people seeking ceremony, potluck, you name it, they have access to go to their people leader now and say, hey, from ceremonial side of things, I'd like to utilize 2 cultural leave days. And I've ensured to work with within the people and culture team too, that our EFAP supports have access to Indigenous experts, Indigenous counselors who have that background and that knowledge for supporting survivors, intergenerational survivors and their families. We also finalized and released an engagement policy and guidelines, where I also then went to all the teams who engage with Indigenous peoples and First Nations regularly in their work and walked them through what does it mean to engage appropriately, what does it mean to ask about protocol, what does it mean to give a gift, what does it mean to follow up, what does timelines look like, because again, we need to be comfortable in adjusting our timelines based on communities and their engagement fatigue, which is very, very common at this time. And all of this is on the hub if you want to access it. So if you want to read through the engagement policy and guidelines, I recommend so. It's honestly a great framework just in general for anyone looking to engage with First Nations communities. For people who've taken part in our anti-collective workshops, those are more of that hands-on learning opportunity to work with material, to understand, the harvest and the sourcing of materials that really goes into it, because it's so much more than just taking from the earth. It is this reciprocal relationship, which is so beautiful. There's an offering made to the lands before Indigenous people take anything, before even from an animal, if we're utilizing a hide. And so anti-collective, another great opportunity if you want to do some more learning or anywhere where you want to grab someone a gift, really local to Victoria and to Lekwungen peoples. Anti-collective is a great place to go and support. And then Victoria Orange Shirt Day, as everyone is aware, we spend so much of September acknowledging the work that Victoria Orange Shirt Day does. And a couple of years ago, Eddie Charlie, residential school survivor of Cooper Island, co-founder also of Victoria Orange Shirt Day, came in person to share his story with a bunch of staff who were able to sign up. That's what this picture reflects here, is some of the group who was able to listen to him speak. And again, it's not a light topic, but I always say if you're going to really understand this work, it's listening to survivors, because unfortunately they've had to carry the harms and the mistreatment and that attempted genocide that they basically had to live through. And so this is really some of the things we've been able to do in terms of advancing employment and education. And again, recognizing there's so much more to do, which I will touch on kind of where our next steps are at as we move forward through the presentation. Which then, so we have relationships, employment and education. And so what is inclusive governance? Like I mentioned, it's really aligning with that more 2I way of seeing approach. And so Indigenous leaderships and perspective really leading the work. So I'm excited to share about the 2 committees and 1 working group that we have within the organization. So we have myself, Indigenous Relations Manager, and I chair both of these groups. All decisions in terms of our Indigenous relations work and our efforts towards reconciliation are guided by these 2 groups. So the Indigenous Relations Steering Committee is ultimately that executive level of just approval for decisions. Myself, I chair that along with Julia is actually in the steering committee as well, and it brings together various leaders from the organization who really have a call to this work. It was very strategic in how we implemented who was members of this work. And we, of course, have, even beyond just myself, but we do have multiple Indigenous members within that Indigenous Relations Steering Committee as well. We then, under the steering committee, have the Indigenous Relations Working Group. And this is really the group that carries out a lot of this work, champions and advocates for what needs to change, and really ultimately represents this within the organization. This working group is created of just Indigenous employees. And so they're from across the organization. We have 7 members. They range from my role to operators, to transit supervisors, to a web strategist. And so really we're bringing all aspects of the organization together so that we can holistically look at what's working and what is not, and really taking the Indigenous employment experience into consideration when looking to build change. As well, from that relationship perspective, it's so great to have a group together where, we can go and say, hey, in terms of National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I think this, I want to know though, what are the other aspects maybe that we're missing? You might have various relationships that we can touch on to kind of further this work. And so very early stages, I think the steering committee has probably been in place now for almost a year, and the working group is going up on 6 months. And as I talk further about some of the work that we're doing going forward, these 2 groups, especially the Indigenous Relations Working Group, is going to be instrumental in making sure that this work happens and to make sure it happens right. Now, being part of the Indigenous Relations Working Group, I also want to recognize that comes with so much history. That comes with the story that I shared maybe about myself, and the vulnerability that it takes really to be comfortable stepping into this work. And so I wanted to just take a moment to play a video of from one of our Indigenous Relations Working Group members, Ken Seymour, and he was so wonderful last year when the Idea Forum called for employee stories around truth and reconciliation. And he was so kind with his time and really was able to give us that understanding into what it is to be Indigenous, beyond just an employee. So I just want to play the video for everybody. And I also just want everyone to acknowledge that Indigenous people have so much history beyond who you see them as everyday professionally. And so this kind of comes into that listening and that learning aspect of, you never know who has what identity. You never know who has what story. And this goes beyond Indigenous peoples. It goes into my passion for the Idea Forum and the work Idea does as well. Is we are all individuals with our own backgrounds, with our own stories. And so moving forward every day with kindness and with compassion for the people we work every day with. And so with that, I'm going to just play Ken's video, and I just want everyone to sit back, enjoy, and reflect on his incredible story and his willingness and vulnerability in sharing.
My name's Ken Seymour. I've been working here in Victoria for BC Transit for almost 4 years now. I'm here to take some time today to reflect on where I grew up and the Indigenous culture. I am a proud Indigenous person from the Sawridge First Nation, which means the people where the two rivers meet in our Dakat language. And that is because where I grew up is in the city of Prince George, and that is where the Nechako River and the Fraser River meet. I am the son of a residential school survivor. My father and his siblings attended the Jack Residential School. My father himself attended residential school for almost 7 years of his life. Just before my father passed away was when he started sharing a bit of his story and the things he had to endure while attending this school. And they're heart-wrenching, to say the least. Imagine yourself being a 5-year-old child, or maybe you're a parent and you have a 5-year-old child, having them taken away and sent to a school that from Prince George is approximately 150 kilometers away. That would be hard for a child. But not just that, when you go there, you're told you can no longer practice your culture that you've been raised or speak the language that you know how to communicate. And that has caused many trials and tribulations over the years for people that endured that and have had to face that. The residential school system is something that didn't happen 200-300 years ago. The last Indian residential school closed in Saskatchewan in 1996. Speaking to a lot of my family and different Indigenous people, when we had the remains found in Kamloops at their residential school site, it brought up a lot of wounds for people. And my father and his siblings, they always said that they remembered the ones who never made it home. It's a shocking story to share, but it's something I feel needs to be shared, and it's important. With having National Truth and Reconciliation Day, it's important not to just view it as another holiday or a day off. This is a day that has been set for us to take time or initiatives to remember something that has happened and pay respects. Indigenous cultures, very oral-based traditions and history being shared. And it's important to let those ones share their story because that's part of their healing. The fondest memories I have are going out fishing with my dad and uncles and dip netting for salmon on the Fraser. Like my dad and that uncle would build the dip net, and it would go out, I want to say 6 or 8 feet in the river. I was quite young. So it wasn't, the safest way, but it was a traditional way of fishing. And we used to fish for the needs for our family. And that's the thing. I was very much instilled an importance of conservation and a respect for animals and life. I have a lot of fond memories of doing that and catching the salmon and learning, being taught, how to properly gut a salmon, in essence, to properly eat it and how to cook it. And my dad used to have a smokehouse, so we would smoke smoked salmon, moose meat. That's the best candy there is in the world to have and share. So that's a bit of the story I wanted to share today, and the importance of taking the time and speaking to ones, then learning their culture and history, not just on Truth and Reconciliation Day, but on Indigenous Peoples Day. But any time of the year, you can speak to someone if they're willing to share their story. Please take the opportunity to listen. It's not just a sign of respect, but it will help you understand and learn a lot of the things that Indigenous people have faced over the years.
Oh, I can never watch that without crying. So let's just huge thank you to Ken, who is on the call today. I won't make you speak, but just the vulnerability in sharing your story. And what I just always wanted to reflect off with that video is just there are so many people you come across in a day-to-day that have that history, that have that background. And everybody has their own trauma, their own history that shapes who they are today. And I think when it comes to reconciliation, just reflecting on the fact that, you know, there's the trauma and then there's the history and then there's the silencing that comes with that, the attempting to quiet those voices. And so at the end of Ken's video, he mentioned, you know, if you are with someone who is comfortable sharing, ask questions. That's the best way to learn. It's how I learn when I go back to my community and I talk to my aunties or my uncles. I am always just like sitting there in storytelling, having those verbal conversations. And again, what I mentioned at the beginning, it's uncomfortable. This work is not comfortable, and that is okay. And ask those uncomfortable questions because we've been living with it. And it's so nice to be at a point where we can finally let that go. And believe me, not that it's let go, but in the sense that we can share it, we can start to communicate it, put words to our experience. And so just wanting to play that video because I could not do this work without the Indigenous Relations Working Group, not just in carrying out work, but also in my own support system, to be able to come together with a group who is so passionate about moving this forward and who's coming up with their own ideas. Ken has been so instrumental in volunteering his time to spread this message across the organization. Another working group member, Hervé, has been so incredible. I said, hey, I think it'd be really awesome to put territorial acknowledgements on the bottom of all of the website headers, like for each region. And he ran with it. And within a week, he came back. He's like, yep, we can do it. Like, let's get the acknowledgements going. And so I could not do the work I did without that support of these working group members. And as well as everyone in the organization, just breaking down the barriers to make this impactful change. So, grabbing myself together here, moving into sustainable funding. So I put the definition of this because what is sustainable funding? So it's really addressing those funding gaps and in exploring those innovative solutions to meet the needs of Indigenous peoples and communities. This comes with challenges because I think we all know the financial climate of the world is very unsettled right now. And so I'd be lying if I said from a provincial and federal perspective, it sometimes feels like there's funding solutions, but they don't actually solve much. There is funding available from an annual basis. There's lots that out there that could support whether it's shelter improvements on First Nations communities, whether it's enhancing, I guess, bus signage. But a lot of those intakes are on an annual basis, so it becomes quite challenging because in terms of providing transit services, we need to ensure that that can be done on a multiple annual basis and not just 1 year. And so really, BC Transit, we advocate. We have those conversations at the provincial level. We make sure to have a strong understanding at a federal level of the opportunities available, and we advocate. Part of my role and part of the great work that the government relations team is we are constantly in conversation with First Nations communities around what are your challenges, what matters to you in terms of access and transit access, and with the whole history, that financial burden should not fall on the nation. That should not fall on Indigenous people to undo the broken system that was imposed upon them. And so really it's on governments to step up and find those funding solutions. And so part of my role is a huge advocate. I work monthly with the Ministry of Transit and Transportation to advocate, hey, this is a scenario happening in this one First Nation in terms of access to transportation. And here's why we can't financially provide any solution. And so really, we are huge advocates in the role that we do. However, the areas we do have control is that project funding, that capacity funding side of things. And so for all our major infrastructure projects, we ensure to build into the budget that those conversations around land and projects are done with Indigenous people. And we're providing them that payment for their knowledge and their expertise being shared, as well as honorariums. I think sometimes people are like, for example, if we're opening up a Rev Banquet, for example. It's a lot to ask an Indigenous person to come and speak to land and speak to knowledge and speak to history. So there needs to be what is known as a handshake. So culturally, it's called a handshake, which used to be an actual transition of gifts between two, whether it's two elders, whether it's two knowledge keepers, often medicine, often grounded in ceremony, and recognizing again that two-eyed way of seeing things have changed over time. That handshake is now seen as honorarious, so providing them time for their knowledge shared. And we finally have ironed out a process within BC Transit that allows us to kind of keep to what that intention was built off of, making sure that, instead of a vendor check request or all these things, we're able to actually stay true to Indigenous culture and provide just that cash, that thank you. So again, same thing. It's on the hub if anyone wants kind of guidance and understanding to how do I do that? How do I know a dollar value? Things like that. We have all those resources as well on the hub. So these are some areas where we either have advocated and continue to advocate, or have kind of been able to make some sort of financial impact here. And lastly, and I think this one is really, when you look at what BC Transit is the one that you're like, well, that's where we can make it happen. And that's enhancing access to transit. It's what we do. We put buses on the road to connect people. And so some of the things we've already done is we have the Highway 16, which also is referred to as the Highway of Tears. And in 2017, our local governments, community partners, and government relations teams and planners work together with First Nations along that corridor to implement transit services that allows people that connection. There's still always improvements. Again, this is about listening, learning, doing what we can, and then going back and saying, what's working, what's not. But knowing that highway is known for the Highway of Tears, given its high percentage of missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls along that corridor, it was a huge step for our organization to be able to bring transit service and access to that area. Again, recognizing there's always so much more we can do and areas we can improve. West Coast Transit System launched in March of 2025 as well. And while it was incredible to launch a new service that served so many communities, so many Indigenous communities, it was also our first transit system that utilized Indigenous language on signage. So if you've ever gotten a chance to go up there, or maybe you've seen some photos of the signage, all of the bus signage through that corridor is also translated into Channel, which is the local Indigenous language for their territories there. That also hasn't slowed down. We are in constant conversation, and I'm working with marketing on what we can build out so that as more communities are interested in bringing this on board, that there's no barriers or limitations on our end, and that we're in full support of getting that moving. And then community partnership agreements. And so what is a community partnership agreement? It's a agreement where the First Nation can pay the cost of what the service is to their community. So not the entire operating costs, but really ensuring and being in commitment and contract with the local government so that they are guaranteed that service to their community, and they always will have a say in terms of, access to it, making sure the times meet their community needs. So that's enhancing access and some of the things we've been able to do. And now I'm also going to recognize this is probably the area that poses us some of the most challenges and some of the most barriers. Before I dive into that, I feel like I've been talking forever and I haven't really reflected and touched in on the group. So off the top of your head, it could be in your own work, it can be just in BC Transit's world in general, but I am curious, in your own words, what challenges or barriers might impact our ability to keep momentum towards reconciliation? And again, another word cloud. Word clouds are so simple, but I find they're so impactful. One of my favorite things to use. Funding, yep, absolutely. Yeah, racism, that denialism, I think, in terms of just Indigenous people's will to kind of keep the conversation going. that denialism, that racism has a huge impact on that because it can get very exhausting. Roles and responsibilities. Toes? Just toes. I like it. Change resistance, absolutely. Resource constraints, yes. And I feel like everyone can feel that one. Political appetite. Some of these I'm like, Svea, don't get on your soapbox because I could. Incredible. Time constraints. I think also the lack of understanding is huge in terms of across the board. I think lack of understanding of regulation, lack of understanding of what BC Transit actually has control to do and what we don't. Amazing. And more come to mind, yeah, feel free to pop those in the chat. So barriers and challenges, yes, everybody was correct. All of those things create barriers and create challenges. And in terms of BC Transit ourselves, I'm going to touch on a few that really impact that movement of enhancing access, particularly in that guiding pillar. Okay, so something that people might not be aware of, because something, especially if you don't work in that government relations world or you don't work in the planning world where you understand the contracts that go into our annual operating agreements, the wording that goes into our annual operating agreements, those annual operating agreements being the contracts. But our governance and how really our funding model works falls all within under the BC Transit Act. Which is within the Ministry of Transit and Transportation and ultimately mandated by the government. And it calls that annual operating agreements can be signed with basically any form of tax-paying government. And so where the limitation lands with that is that means we can actually not, based on legislation, sign an annual operating agreement with a First Nation if they do not have that taxpayer dollar income stream for us to be in direct agreement with. And so first question I usually get is, well, nations here, we want to be in conversation, and it's, okay, great, let's move forward with the BC Transit model. Well, the cost sharing component of that, and for anyone who wants to dive into that, feel free to reach out to me afterwards, but that is a huge cost share, and that involves buses, that involves drivers, that involves an opco, and First Nations should not be the ones who we call to have that upfront, that much cost just to give them service to a territory, by the way, that was imposed on them. They didn't choose to have these locations of reserves. And so to give everyone context, there's only one First Nation in the entire province where we are actually in an annual operating agreement with, and that's West Bank First Nation, because West Bank First Nation is a modern treaty who moved through so many steps with the federal government to claim that self-determination and rights to tax their members. And it is very, very hard to do. And I will say, because you might hear that and say, well, why wouldn't all nations do that? There was a huge cost implication to that. There is aspects of rights that were had to be given up in order to access that, because that was established well before a lot of these calls for change. And so with that, that's where those community partnership agreements come in, is because we recognize that there's been no way within our legislation to be in that direct agreement and contract to ensure that transit services are brought to those communities. So we brought in the community partnership agreements. Again, we can't be in that exact contract through that annual operating agreement with First Nations. So the First Nations then can sign an agreement with the local government, because the local government is the one who holds that annual operating agreement. The municipality level, they're the ones that are using taxpayer dollars to ensure that they're providing those transit services within their city or within their municipality. So community partnership agreements work between the First Nation, us, and the municipality or local government. The payment goes through from the First Nation to the municipality. ultimately, that allows and guarantees the First Nation access to services to their community, but still has limitations in the sense of the rest of the rest of the city, the rest of the community in which those transit services are being served. The First Nations don't have the opportunity to be involved in those conversations. For example, let's use Victoria as an example. I look at Rock Bay, where Anti-Collective is so close to BC Transit. And if you talk or do any sort of discovery into the history of Lekwungen territory, there are some very important sacred aspects to this land. There are so many areas where, Rock Bay was actually where other nations would come and visit, and they would provide trade there. And that's where they would gather to be like, is this good relationship? We're here to welcome you. And that was actually the meeting and the gathering place. And the community partnership agreements don't allow First Nations to have an input into the transit services amongst the whole territory. They are able to guarantee service to their reserve territory, to their community, but it doesn't give them that self-determination rights holding position that basically reconciliation is calling for. So it is a challenge and it is a barrier because while we have a temporary solution, I'm always the first one to say, and we can do better. There is more we can do to bring that decision-making aspect back to the Indigenous communities. And then let's also talk about community remoteness. So I kind of touched on that as well. And there are so many First Nations located close proximity to all of our Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 systems. There are also so many across the province that are hours away from any sort of larger community, and that lacks so much access. But then again, bringing back in that BC Transit model is where those challenges arise. For us to operate buses, drivers, and all that, the cost implication for something so remote. And so this is where my role really starts to get complex, and I think is the aspect that a lot of people aren't aware of, is like, I then work really closely with the province to talk about those. The solution isn't always going to be BC Transit in terms of transportation, mobility, and equity. There needs to be, whether it's a bus shuttle program, again, funded by someone who's not the First Nations. Is it BC Bus North? Is that a solution? And so working closely with them as well. And so just recognizing that depending sometimes on location, BC Transit won't be the solution there. Also recognizing where those TPAs, so those community partnership agreements, and where there's those needs for those annual operating agreements, and that's where I advocate again with the province. Hey, this community brought up that this doesn't align to TRIPA. This isn't aligned to the calls to action for TRC, and this doesn't fall within something I can do at BC Transit. So I have to go to the next decision maker, which ultimately can be the province, it can be the federal government, but again, being that crown agency, there's so much we can do and there's so much that we can't. And then service implementation model. So again, I talked about that cost sharing aspect of how currently, again, it's almost 50% falls within the municipality and the other 50% within the province and BC Transit. And that is a lot to ask of First Nations, again, when that remote location of where their territory has been displaced was not their decision. And again, municipalities often won't touch reserve territory. So oftentimes another thing we hear is like, our bus stops are not safe. They are not accessible. They are not, and we see the municipality putting all this money into these beautiful bus stops. What about us? And again, because it's on reserve territory, and something some people might not know is like, we actually don't own bus stop locations. That falls within each individual municipality, and we have the program to support with that, and we have the branding, and we have access to all the materials, and we support with that journey. But in terms of paying for it, that falls within the municipality. And so just so many complexities around enhancing access that I think is an area that we need to challenge and we need to advocate for. And I'm such a nerd about this stuff now. Like, I really am happy to talk through if anyone has more questions after the fact, or if your role feels like there's limitations in this side of things, or if you have solutions, like I am all ears. It's so fun sometimes to further our employment and education work and all these stuff that brings a learning journey to everybody. But at the end of the day, it's about connecting people. It's about connecting Indigenous peoples to community, ceremony, education, healthcare, you name it. And that is a direct call from the TRC calls to action. And so, in whatever role you are in, if you have any of these limitations that are causing slow progress in terms of reconciliation and the impact you can make, please let me know, because I want to know more of how I can challenge this at the right level and make sure that we can start to push for the change that's needed. All right, so all the challenges, all of the guiding pillars, and now I want to touch on what's next. And again, recognizing that this is a slow moving process. I'm all about, and the steering committee is all about, and the working group is all about implementing things that are tangible. It's not beneficial for anyone if we create this extensive plan that says that looks good on paper, but if we actually can't make it happen, then like no point. And so the grounding and imperative work that I am currently drafting and getting approval for, and Julia and all the other experts in this space are also going to be taking a look at it. It's going to go to the working group soon as well. And that is our Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation Action Plan. So this is kind of a perfect opportunity just for me to tee it up, in the sense that it's getting drafted, and once that gets finalized and approved and we'll move forward in the fiscal 25-26 year, it's going to come with actions under each guiding pillar that expand beyond Indigenous relations. So you'll likely all hear about it from your people leader at some point as we start to determine where various action items fall and which teams those fall within. Recognizing that, we understand there is obviously a training component and a learning component that comes to that. And so we're very excited in this action plan to embed learning opportunities and what we see as something that, you know, is specific to various roles, but also kind of that wider spread training, cultural safety and humility understanding across the organization. It's as I mentioned, going to call for that shared responsibility, role-specific resources, and then most importantly, it's going to establish targets for monitoring. And so a lot of times I get, you can't put targets to this, you can't put numbers to this work. It isn't work that, you know, is quantifiable via a percentage. And while I can agree with that, I still think there are aspects we could be tracking and monitoring to see the success in this. I want to know, you know, if we're not seeing an increase in Indigenous employment applicants, why? Because there's a reason. There's always a reason for that. And that doesn't just stop at BC Transit. That's relationships and having the right people talking to, you know, Victoria Native Friendship Center, Songhees, Kusepsum, all of the communities in which we serve who have access to employment here. And so targets and monitoring is key to this work, because again, while you can have actions in place, how do we actually know we're making a difference? How do we actually know that there is positive change coming from this? And so these are some things that are kind of coming to mind and that will be in that action plan. But I am really curious, like, from everyone here, after you've heard this long-winded me talking, what comes to mind in terms of meaningful changes that you could see BC Transit taking on to kind of continue our journey? There we go. I was like, are we doing everything right? The act, yes. Community calls. Nation's language, yes. Amazing. Oh, this makes me so happy. This aligns a lot with things that have kind of already have conversations happening in the background. We are having so many conversations around what it looks like for signage, language translations, training and learning. A lot of that is going to be coming through in that action plan as well. Amazing. Okay, so that's BC Transit, and I'm almost at the end here, and so I think one more question I do want to ask. So outside of BC Transit, just hearing this and recognizing again, it's that shared responsibility for everybody. I am curious, what is something within your own personal journey towards reconciliation that you feel like you can implement, something that is actionable for you to kind of take away today, and something you maybe want to commit to yourself? And if we don't have a word cloud, we can throw that in the chat. I know, Julia, I'm sorry, I just threw this one out there. All right, chat for this one. What's something you can implement? Absolutely. Having uncomfortable conversations, asking questions. Yes, and that's the biggest thing. You can research what's going on in your community, what's happening locally. Jeff, I love that. Learning sessions as part of your monthly meeting. Something actually the P&C team does in our divisional meetings is every time we meet, someone new is responsible for the territorial acknowledgement, because we recognize it's so common often for people leaders or chairs of meetings to be leading that. So we actually kind of shuffle it up, and you also are expected to kind of come with more than just the territorial acknowledgement, but we've been slowly moving through the various 94 calls to action, and we speak to a new call to action, 2 new calls to action every time we come together for a meeting. So yeah, like what are ways to embed it into your team meetings? Volunteer with local nation for community events. Yes. Jody actually just did a really cool event with Sawridge First Nation, asking questions. Yeah. And this is going to be my little now plug for September 30th. There are so many things happening in this city. There is the Capital Bike journey, which is ran by Victoria Orange Shirt Day. And so if you want to bike that morning representing your orange shirt, it is like so many people. The South Island Powwow as well is a very, very inclusive space for non-Indigenous people to kind of get that exposure to what it's like at a powwow. And another thing I always want to acknowledge is just your Indigenous friends and family. It is a day that isn't necessarily celebratory. And so also reconciliation ride. Thank you, Ken. I was like, they bike. And I've actually never taken part in it. And this is the first year I'm going to be attending. So if anyone wants to do that ride, I will be there as well. And so this is remembrance. This is honoring. It is not, we have Indigenous History Month and National Day, National Indigenous Peoples Day in June, and that really calls for celebration. But for your Indigenous friends and your Indigenous colleagues, just be mindful that that day comes with a lot of mourning. It comes with a lot of challenges. And so really for non-Indigenous people to be allies on that day is all we can ask for, is stepping forward and doing that learning, because sometimes that day for us is one of reflection, and one where we actually don't want to be around many people. We actually sometimes need that time and that space. Amazing. Thank you everyone for how involved you were, how much you shared during that conversation. I really hope you were able to take something away. The email to our Indigenous Relations email is here, and I want you to utilize that. Anything I spoke on today that you have further questions on and want to ask, I am all ears. I love to talk about this stuff. If there's areas in your role which you see change can be made, let's definitely have a discussion. And challenges, barriers, like there's, again, those uncomfortable conversations. There's nothing that isn't okay to bring my way in terms of reconciliation, because I want to just make sure that I'm hearing from employees and understanding where we can make impact. And so thank you.
Thank you so much, Svea. I'm going to stop the recording in just a moment to really open it up for people. We have 5 minutes left. But before I do that, I just wanted to say, Svea, thank you so much. This was a very, very powerful session. And I just want to say how grateful I am for you. And I also want to say how lucky we are at BC Transit to have you lead this work. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.